Okay, we can get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest session in our series. Um, I'm glad you all made it. I know that the afternoon time was a little bit of a curveball, but congratulations, you're all paying attention. And so remember, the next session is we're going to do it the same way. We're also going to do it with Zoom only. And then what we will attempt, or at least inquire about, is maybe Mark's final session in sort of late June. Um, we'll see if we can have that in person. We will have a Zoom option, but maybe if we say, okay, it's the concluding session, and maybe we have some refreshments after it, sort of at 4 o'clock when we're done. Um, and we'll see if enough people are interested in coming here in person. What I will do is, a couple of weeks before that date, I'll send out an email like I did the last time, and you all can tell me, I'm in, I'll be there, or you can tell me, combination of Mark plus refreshments, no, I'll stay on Zoom. And and then I'll tally up the votes and we'll decide what to do. But that's what
Mike,
we'll
I can be very refreshing myself.
try. So, but the next session will be done exactly like this one. And then we'll see if we can do something just a little bit different for the final session. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let Mark get started. I hope quite a number of you had a chance to read the story. I know that there were several copies in various libraries, even though the story was not available online, at least as far as I could find. So I hope that one way or another in the last number of weeks, a lot of you had a chance to read it. So with that, I turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. So today's story and next time's story are two of 11 stories from a collection called Moral Disorder that Margaret Atwood published in 2006. So we are now into the 21st century as contrasted to the first three books we did, stories we did. Um, the Garden Party was slightly tinged by the consciousness of the young woman, but was not first person narration. Uh, where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Was also not first person narration. And then No Name Woman was intently first person. Here, today, and next time, we have a first person narrator. And in fact, it's the same person as a teenager and then adult in today's story, and next time as a 12-year-old girl saddled with having to take care of her disabled pregnant mother who's about to give birth to the girl who's the younger sister in this story. I hope that makes sense. The reason I reversed the order, this story today's comes later in the volume than next time's, is because the next story I think is the better story, even as this is a good one. It's called The Headless Horseman, not just because there is a costume that the unnamed in this story young woman makes as a teenager. We know from other stories in the collection that her name is Nell. It's not only named the Headless Horseman because of that costume, a big pumpkin head that comes off and is held under the arm of the person in the costume, but a number of the stories in the volume were named after either poems like My Latch Duchess by Robert Browning, or The Art of Cooking and Serving, which is an actual book. That's the title of next time's story. Or even the book itself being called Moral Disorder is a title that Margaret Atwood took from her husband, who abandoned a novel he was writing at the time and intended to use the title Moral Disorder. And when he no longer decided to go on with the novel, she took the title. I take moral disorder to mean that these stories, like most literary fiction, shows you what can come from the disorder of life. That the disorder of life doesn't just have a moral in the sense of Aesop's fables, but there is a moral understanding to what it is that is the chaos of our lives. So I will say that in the garden party, there's a slight relationship that doesn't really come to the fore between siblings, the narrator and her brother, the main character and her brother, but it's not very well developed. In Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? There is an older sister, but there's no relationship worthy of the name. They're not close. And in No Name Woman, she's the only girl in the family, and that's part of her plight. It's not, none of those novels, none of those stories are about sibling relationships. With today's story and Next Time, we see the interaction of two girls in a family where the mother is often out of the picture with her pregnancy and her various ailments, and the father is very much an absent figure, present but not influential. Both of these stories and other stories in the volume are based loosely on her own life. Born in 1939, she had an older brother. She has a younger sister, 11 years younger than she, as the girl in the story does. Her father was a very hardworking and well known entomologist and insect scientist, and she spent many hours in the wilds of Ottawa camping with the family as he did his field work. And that's covered in one of the stories in the volume as well. The reason this is significant is you could take an almost Freudian reading of Headless Horseman to say this is a family that doesn't have a head, where in Next Time story, the older girl is forced to fend for herself. And in this story, the most significant act that the parents take in the story is they go away. They go away, they say for 2 weeks. It turns out if you do the math, it's more like 3 weeks. The most significant action is their absence. And during that time, the older sister, who is now a young woman, serves as a kind of surrogate to the younger sister, who is a teenager. And they take a day trip, among other things, during that nearly month of absent parents to Kitchener, and they have a good but not great time, as you'll remember. And I do think part of the sensibility of the story is the parents are largely absent. The father used to do archery, and in the trunk room where the head of the Headless Horseman costume is still resting, his archery stuff is there. Archery in literature is associated most significantly with the Roman goddess Diana. That is not to say that archery is a female sport, but in literature, archery is much more commonly associated with hunting women than with men. And it's certainly true that in this week's story and Next Time, the focus is very much on women, daughters, sisters, mothers, and so on. And whether that's intentional or not doesn't matter to me. I think it's part of the substance of the story. So, one thing that's significant in the story, and I don't know how many of you have read it, but I hope a number of you have, is that the younger girl likes to be scared by her older sister. She wants to be scared and promises in the real time of this story that she won't get upset and run away the way she always does. And the older sister says, I know you will. And the little girl says she won't. And sure enough, she runs and hides in the closet and won't come out. I take that to mean, I take the significance of that is that the story is partly, and it's set in the current day when these two older women, much older, are on a car trip to visit their mother as her health is failing. That's the present time of the story. But it goes back to the Halloween where the older girl made the costume. I'm only summarizing so much in case a significant number of you weren't able to read the story for today. So I take it that what the daughter, the younger daughter, they don't have names in the story. What the younger daughter is doing is she's trying to figure out what's the most productive relationship she can have with her older sister, who she partly fears the way that people fear parents. I think these parents are not very present in the story in their daughter's lives. She's partly intrigued by the fact that the older sister is a grown up and has moved out of the house. Um, she says to her later, "You abandoned me." And the older sister says, "I grew up. That's what happens. You leave home." And so the monster, let's play monster, scare me, is the younger girl's way. And I'm not trying to be particularly psychological, but trying to figure out what is my relationship to this older girl. And we see what it becomes when they're driving together, and the 11-year difference between their ages doesn't matter anymore, or doesn't matter the same way, that they're now both mature women. Uh, I do think that one of the reasons why the younger girl uh, takes a fancy to the pumpkin head and puts it in her tea parties with her friend, it's a way of taming or domesticating the weirdness of how she feels about her sister. So that head is a big jack-o'-lantern. In the context of the Ichabod Crane story, it's a beheaded person. Beheading is one of the most significant traumas that we can think of in terms of human maiming. Um, it has a kind of Jungian trauma to it. And as you know, not only are dead people who are on city streets have their face covered, but you would never see a decapitated body in any place where somebody in authority could close it up. And the beheadings done over the last few years publicly by various terrorist groups knew exactly what they were doing, because beheading is deeply traumatic to the human psyche. So I think what the little girl is doing is she's trying to take this very scary head, jack o' lantern head, and domesticating it by putting it at a tea party. And she's doing what she can't do with her sister, which is include her in her play. And I think it's very poignant. I don't think it's particularly complicated. I don't think I'm particularly insightful, but I do think that's what we're to understand. And then the story moves forward to the car trip they're taking together to visit their mother. And among other things, they talk about that the day will come when they have to figure out what to do with her stuff. And the older sister says, "Whatever happened to that head?" And the younger sister says, "It's still in mom's trunk room with the other garbage." And so it comes back to that thing. And the narrator uses the phrase, um, the persistence of material objects. And I'm hoping that this, I'm going to stop talking in about a minute. I'm hoping that the story resonates with some of you in terms of siblings, sisters dealing with um, less effective parents, maybe dealing with a sibling who has mental health challenges, and also your own experience of the persistence of objects. I imagine that some number of you have had in your life experience the occasion to visit, if not the home of a parent or grandparent, someone in the family, and you see something that you are amazed is still around. Aunt Ethel still kept it. Uncle Bob had this out in his garage and he didn't know. And that thing, that object, whatever it is, resonates with you with a certain power. I want to encourage you in the comment section, which is coming up, if this story triggers any of those recollections or emotions, that's very much what the story is about. So I'll stop there, Michael, and let you play Phil Donahue.
Okay, Mark. All right, folks. So you know the drill and how it works. Use the Q&A to put in any question or comment. Try to stick with what Mark's prompting on there, but we're flexible, and I'll relay them as I see them.
So I will say, as I fill time, that when there's a lot of artistic issues to talk about, as I did with the garden party, I'm happy to talk more about technique than what you might call story or plot. And you saw how much time we spent on that single paragraph in Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? I don't think this is an unsophisticated story, but this story's resonance has much more to do with its themes of family life, sisterhood, mothers and daughters, parents and children, and so on.
Okay, first question that pops up is from Anonymous.
I've heard so much about you.
Do you think the oldest sister ever comes to resent having to play mother to her younger sister?
So I'll tell you that when you have read Next Time Story, you will see that the older sister resents having to be a surrogate mother before the baby's born. She has to tend her mother. And we will see that next time. And again, the only reason I'm doing it out of the sequence is I think the Next Time Story is richer. But yes, there's certainly resentment. Here, the narrator, remember, the two women, only one of them's telling the story. The older, non-mentally ill sister is telling the story. She has that authority. Everything we learn from her. And if you've read the story, you know that the sister, the younger sister, has the habit of calling anybody who she doesn't like the driving of Fred. And during the trip to their mother's house, she's constantly scolding one or another uh, Fred for not driving well. Uh, I do think there's resentment when she's younger, and you'll see that in Next Time Story. But I think in this story, she has a deep compassion for her younger sister, which is how the story ends.
So Ben is asking, could you comment on the statement by Nell at the end that all doors used regularly are doors to the afterlife?
Yeah. So let me say that I'm happy to make comments, but I want to call your attention that I'm hoping some of you will offer some, you don't have to be confessional, but will offer some details from your own life about a story that I think is so intimate about family relations. So I'm sure many of you have a translation of what that means, that all doors that are used are doors to the afterlife. A door that you use regularly, and they use it in the context of going into their mother's home, which is the home they grew up in, and going through the door that they've gone through literally hundreds of times. And what she means, I think, or what Margaret Atwood has her mean, is that when that door that they know so well to their mother's house is something they're encountering now as their mother is approaching her end, so failing in her health that they're thinking about the next time they have to get together and divvy up stuff. It's a door to the afterlife because that door will eventually not be the door to their mother's house because the mother won't live there anymore. And the doors you go through incidentally, including the door to the Wilton Library, has no resonance for us, even if you love the Wilton Library, because it's not connected to your history, your autobiography. But the narrator saying that door, that piece of wood, that door that needs to be painted, is going to be a door to the afterlife, not in the sense of heaven and eternity, but the life after the mother's gone, which will be part of what they'll be dealing with soon. And I hope that I'm not the only one who can think as I sit here of various doors in my growing up that I remember very well, even down to their color and how often I went in or out of that door as a young and then older person. And I think there's a poignancy in that. I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Thanks, Mark. I've got a comment. I've got to read it a little bit. It's a little bit long.
I will tell you that the foster mother who raised me was very fond of saying about the door to her home, in or out, I don't want to heat the entire neighborhood. I heard that many times. Close the door. So, Michael, to fill time, I'm going to say something else that's not irrelevant. I have taught sessions on how to write a memoir, workshops in libraries, sometimes in retirement homes, where, based on my own seat of the pants experience, I give people 4 or 5 exercises over a month. And one of them is to write a memory of someone who was important to them in their past who's still alive, and they have to write about that person in the room that we're in the library conference room, without access to that person. And then their next assignment is to read that story to the person they were writing about and have that person make a contribution. But another exercise I give them is, what's something that you still have in your possession that has a deep resonance for your past, whether it was something given to you by a parent or grandparent, whether it's something you made as a child and it has a place of honor in your memory or your home, and write about that thing. And it turns out that many people have more to say about the thing than the person, because they never had a chance to write about the thing, but they're always talking about their mother, their grandmother, their father, their uncle. They're used to talking about family, but they've had this thing that they made as a 5-year-old, and they still have it, and they never got a chance to talk about it, and now they will. Michael,
Yeah, I'm here.
about how many people are in attendance?
About 25.
Okay, so that's a good number, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to say again, I won't plead, but I'll say again, if any of you in reading the story had some thoughts about how it's like anything in your own life, or if you're worried about being too confessional, in movies or plays or other books you've read, where you say, this has a ring of truth for me about this interaction. The younger daughter resents that the older daughter has used up dancing. And the older daughter says in the car ride, as adults, you can't use up dancing. Dance if you want to dance. But we understand from the first story that what she means is, when the older daughter was a teenager, it was in the 50s. If she were Margaret Atwood at 16, it'd be 1952. And in the 1950s, there were sock hops, and dancing as something that teenagers did in the local gymnasium, and they were called sock hops because you danced in gymnasiums and you had to take your shoes off so you didn't mar the basketball court. And that's how they became sock hops. And the younger girl, born 12, 11, 12 years later, that wasn't the deal in the 60s and 70s. That culture had passed on and wasn't as popular as it had been. And the younger girl resents it, and she expresses it as best she can. And the older girl says, if you want to dance, dance. But she misses the point that it's a generational comment. 12 years may not seem like a big difference, but 12-year gap in siblings is significant. I'll say also, this whole series has been dedicated to rites of passage. You'll see that next time. You'll see that in our last story by Claire Keegan, published in 2010, which brings us well into the 21st century. Well, one of the rites of passage here is not just about the girls becoming adults, but having to deal with the rite of passage of a parent who's going to die soon. And that's another way growing up changes you. You don't stop growing up just because you're middle aged. If the issue is that some number of you weren't able to read the story, I can lecture more, even as I hope that those of you who've read it will have some comments to make.
Yeah, just got a comment just popped in from Kate. I found the connection between the sisters in this story very realistic because the rhythms of it reminded me of my relationship with my sister, One thing I'd suggest about the younger sister in the story is that she struck me as justifiably angry about her parents' lack of involvement rather than being mentally ill.
Is that the end of the comment?
Yeah.
So, Kate, let me say I have great affection for you at this moment because you made just the kind of comment I hope someone would make, that it strikes you as realistic. You see some resonances of your own familial relationship, that the illness may be less at play. I do think it's likely that there actually is a chemical imbalance that's being treated by medication, as the older sister mentions about her younger sister. But I do think the fundamental issue is emotional and familial. And here's a strange thing about the parents when we talk about the daughter feeling resentment. Um, the parents decide they're going to go away to Europe. And again, they do this math where they're leaving for a couple of weeks. And then one of the parents says, well, when you add in the travel, it's more like 20 days, which then is 3 weeks. And why are they going to Europe? They want to see castles. Now, I like castles. I respect travelers having whatever reason they want to go, but that these two parents who are approaching 60, which from the point of view of the girls is old, God help us. But what they say is they want to go to Europe to see castles, not for the culture, not for the art, not for the landscape, not for the architecture, not for the people, not for the music, not for the food, but to see castles. Uh, it's a strange kind of fuddy duddy comment and suggests that these parents, as parents, are not the most culturally involved with their daughters. Margaret Atwood recognized that her father's intense interest in bugs and being a published entomologist put him at some distance from her. And of course, she grew up to be a prolific writer of poetry, nonfiction, fiction, graphic novels, short fiction. I mean, dozens of books, 18 books of poetry, 18 novels, collections of short stories, children's books, two graphic novels, just extraordinary. Uh, I do think that comment that they're going to see castles is a little bit of a hint that they may not have the cultural complexity to be attentive parents to two girls. There's no mention of what they're going to do or bring back. There's a way in which the girls' day trip to Kitchener, which has something of a vacation feel to it, uh, is a sign of what they're missing from their parents not taking them on vacation.
So I just got a comment from Anonymous. It says, I also have a younger sister and was often upset with my parents for not providing the understanding she needed. I tried to intervene, but have never been sure my efforts did any good.
Yeah, again, I want to thank you, and I understand you're being anonymous. I want to say that we know from reports of people, it's a very common reaction, and not just of girls, but often of girls, to feel that when they're older than the younger sibling, and especially it seems when they're both girls. I have two girls 7 years apart, but there's a boy in between them, that it falls to them to be a kind of surrogate parent when they think they're old enough and experienced enough to criticize their parents' parenting. God help us, God spare us from children who seem to know too much about that. But I think that's a natural thing that's going to happen for siblings, and it's more likely, I think, to be women than men, that is, girls and boys, who are attentive to what they think the deficiencies in the household are. You'll see it next time's story that the narrator, the unnamed Nell here, has been so put upon in the first story while her mother is bedridden from a pregnancy that she rebels against being treated like a surrogate mother. There's a kind of Cinderella motif there about her being the charwoman in the family.
A quick follow-up question from Kate. Are all the stories in Moral Disorder about Nell and her family? This story makes me want to read the whole volume.
Yeah. No, they're not all about Nell and her family. The only protagonist that figures is Nell, and some of the stories are about her as an adult with partners. And the best story, I would say, Kate, if you read this story and the one assigned next time, and you wanted to read only one other, the last story in the volume that is the most autobiographical about Atwood is called The Boys in the Lab. And the lab is a fieldwork lab of collecting specimens. That's a very powerful and moving story, and that's the most autobiographical in the group. Some of the other stories, again, a total of 11. So the 8 stories that aren't the 3 I mentioned, the 2 we're doing and the boys in the lab, have nothing to do with um, the family and the way we've been talking about. And in fact, I've read all of them, but never taught those other ones. So if you want to concentrate on what I think is the best other story, it's the boys in the lab, the last story in the volume.
Right.
And
So we're
their
gonna
artifact is a photograph she has of these young men who were international students helping her father. And she has a photograph that is the, the memento that she keeps, souvenir.
so we got a comment from Liz. We do not get to choose our time. Nobody does. The place and time in which we live and who we are at that time defines a lot of how we experience our lives. The sock hop is an example of much, much more. The parents were young and inexperienced, but more energetic when the older daughter was born.
Yes, and I want to say, who is that, Liz?
Liz.
Yeah, my eldest daughter is Liz. So that's a brilliant comment, and thank you again for making it. Yes, absolutely. We don't get to choose our time, but our time chooses us. Atwood was born in 1939. She grew up as an infant toddler in during the war, and her parents uh, became a couple and had a baby during the Depression. And in my favorite novel of hers, which is not The Handmaid's Tale, but Cat's Eye, which is a very autobiographical novel, the protagonist of that book is an artist, but a painter rather than a writer, who comes from Western Canada back to Ottawa, back to her hometown, for a retrospective of her work. And she's a big deal. And again, she's a painter. And Cat's Eye, the name of the novel, is also the name of one of her famous paintings. And it turns out that a number of her paintings have as their underlying motif memories, some of them suppressed, of her growing up in Ottawa with her girlfriends. And Cat's Eye is both a reference to a kind of milky marble and a cat's eye. And she's interviewed, this artist is, by either a high school reporter or a college reporter or an impossibly young newspaper reporter, a woman. And the woman says to her, uh, can you tell me something about how your growing up in the Depression formed you? And I'm being more articulate than the reporter is. And the Margaret Atwood figure, the artist who's like Atwood, says, trying to talk to her as if she's from a different planet, you don't understand. We saved string. We brought papers for recycling. We made do. 3 words, a single sentence. She says, we made do. And Atwood, the novelist, is writing that knowing that the young woman, in whatever year it's supposed to be in Canada, has no idea why someone would save string, or back before we were recycling now, recycle papers. And the statement of 3 words, we made do, is absolutely opaque to her. What does it mean to make do? But if you're a Depression era baby, or you are the child of people who were making their early married life during the Depression, you know what she means. But it's like talking across different cultures and languages. So well done, Liz.
Got a comment from Alan. My point is, I thought Mark mentioning that the sisters have no names in the story is also related to the younger sister naming all the other drivers Fred, as if they have no name. The point being that how we name things is more important than what the names are.
Yeah. So I want to say that my take, and it doesn't mean there can't be various interpretations, is she names them Fred so that she can have an intimacy in scolding them. Everything she says is to criticize them for some mistake or stupidity they're doing. And it's easier to scold them if she has a handle until they're all Fred. It's not like Adam naming all the animals in Eden and having a relationship with them. It's a way of getting out her, venting her frustration. And I do think the lack of names, although we know from the other stories in the collection that the young woman, the older sister, is Nell, they don't call each other by any names. And when you have stories in which you have characters who are clearly psychologically and sociologically credible, these two characters seem like real people, and they're not given names, it allows or invites you to think of them as people you know, or versions of yourself, or more generally typical of the world, not to think of them as just these two women from Ottawa, and certainly not to think of them as allegorical or symbolic. These are very, very real kids and young adults and older adults.
So Janet's comment is that the way a door is closed by a person suggests the psychological relationship to the person behind the door.
So, Susanna, that's your original
That's
comment?
Janet.
Oh, Janet, I'm sorry. Is that your original comment, or are you quoting something that I don't know?
I think that's her original comment.
Well, again, uh, guys, Alan and Anonymous, if you're a man, the women are way ahead on points today. Um, that I do think is a very insightful comment. And doors matter in a lot of memoirs because I think of Mary McCarthy's Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, where she says at some point in her childhood, her grandmother's house. I don't think it's an actual blood relation grandmother, but a woman who serves as a grandmother was a very wealthy, pampered, important woman who treated her body as a kind of shrine and was a figure of um, significance in Mary's childhood life. She says at some point she remembers her grandmother's house as filled with closed doors and silences because to a child, a lot of our experience of life in a house is doors that are closed to us. So again, I think that's a very prescient point that you're making.
So we can continue to have questions and comments come in. Right now, Mark, just so you know, there's none in the box. We've gone
Okay.
through them. There could
Can
be
you give
some more.
can you give me a time check?
Yeah, it's 20 to 4.
Okay. So looking ahead to next time as a preview to help you, the art of cooking and serving is an actual publication that was very popular in, I'm going to say the 1950s, but I could be wrong, and sold many, many copies. And it was particularly significant because to people who were interested in baking or cooking with butter, you could not cook with butter in the summer if you didn't have adequate refrigeration. And if you were camping or doing field work, it was de facto that you're not going to have adequate refrigeration. And so Crisco, which was invented about this time, became the substitute for butter. And if those of you who are about my age, I'm soon to be 72, can remember how much Crisco figured in your childhood before people cared about cholesterol, it was everywhere. And the art of cooking and serving partly was a tie-in to recipes for young domestic people, presumably mothers with children, to make things with Crisco instead of butter because butter spoiled and Crisco did not. And that's a small sort of cultural, historical issue going on. So this book actually exists, and the young girl, the older sister in this story, next time is relieved that there's an outlet for her creativity because clearly she's a version of Margaret Atwood. She is a clever girl who's going to be a more clever woman. Uh, she doesn't like the sweeping up, she doesn't like the taking care of the baby, but she likes the idea that she might be a cook or a server. And the book has pictures of maids who would serve dinners and talks about setting a table and doing the kind of thing that a girl like this older girl might be interested in because it gives you some authority over something different from changing diapers or sweeping the floor. The art of cooking and serving has a great appeal to a girl who's based on an artist who's writing the book we're reading.
So I've got another comment from our friend Anonymous, who says, "I'm 70 and busy getting rid of stuff now while I'm healthy, so my children don't have to do it later. It's definitely fraught. The story inspires me to keep going. I'm struck by the mother being stuck in a house that's filled with junk and being overgrown by weeds, with children coming to visit under duress."
Yeah. And they have this conversation about maybe they should invest in a gas powered mower because they have an old physical blade mower that is getting clogged because neither of them has come by to mow their mother's lawn. And that's as good a symbol of anything about how these girls are only unevenly attentive as many children are. And I don't say this critically, I say this neutrally. This is a hard thing for all families. Some older parents are very easy to care for because they welcome the care and they collaborate. And some older parents, I'm an older parent now. I just moved in the last 6 months into a retirement community, independent living, and I got rid of hundreds and hundreds of books. And some older parents are not cooperative. I do think it's a challenge, which is why I say this is a rite of passage, an initiation novel on both ends. And I do think that fact that they can't mow the lawn, well, let's at least trim the edges, is a symbol of a kind of neglect. For one thing, the younger daughter still has psychological trouble. She shares with her sister, presumably during this car ride, that she's had suicidal thoughts. That when she wants to leave, she means leave the planet, leave her body. And that seems to be a new revelation. And we can only imagine that the older sister, given her history with her parents, we see some of that in next time's story, is not eager to be back into the family any more than she wants to, needs to. And so it's telling that something as simple as a lawn that needs to be mowed because it's overgrown, what it tells you about the dynamic. Good luck with your downsizing, and I commend you for thinking of your children the way that you are.
Ben has just added, both the lawn mowing scene and the suicidal thoughts are much earlier in the story, not at the end.
Did I say it was at the end?
You might have. I
Oh,
missed that, I think.
if I said that, I didn't mean to say that, but okay.
That's the last one we had in there for the moment.
Well, I don't know how best to spend my time and yours. I will say that there is a scene in next time's story near the end, and that I'm sure of, where the girl uh, rebels against her mother's directing her like a slave, not a servant, but a slave. And I'm going to encourage you that when you come next time, having read that story, that you reread that passage where, in the last page or two of the story, the girl gives her mother sass, what we used to call sass, and has her face slapped. And I'm going to ask you what you think is particularly significant about that scene, um, beyond the obvious rebellion, because it's one of the ways that that story, I think, has a greater level of sophistication than this story. I'll also say that in the beginning of this story, I think I'm right, she imagines that she's in a hot air balloon traveling over the world, and she thinks that her relationship to the adult world is that she sees them from above and they can't make her out very well because they're at a distance from her. And it's an interesting metaphor for being above the world, but also being distant and also knowing that you can't be seen well because while you can look down on them easily, they can't look up at you very easily if you're in a hot air balloon. And that's a very striking metaphor early-ish in the story. If you wanted to become a better reader of fiction and you did nothing else than mark every time a metaphor or simile was used, it's easier to find similes because they almost always use the word like or than or as. He is as strong as Hercules. Um, and you did nothing but keep track of the metaphors or similes, easier to do in a short story than a novel, you would find you learn a lot about the story you just read and about the person who wrote it if you keep track of similes and metaphors. It's not that hard to do. Metaphors are a little harder, and you're not going to ever want to do it the first time you read a story. That wouldn't be fair to the story. But in rereading it, you can usually pick out metaphors pretty well, and the kinds of metaphors and similes that someone uses tell you a lot about their art and maybe a lot about them as a human being. In Patrimony, the memoir by Philip Roth of his father's last illness and death, he goes up from a party where his wife Claire Bloom is entertaining people because he's concerned that his father, who is aged and dying, has spent too much time upstairs alone, and he finds him in a bathroom having soiled himself disastrously and needing to be showered and have the pajamas put in a bag. And the man, the father, says to him, "Don't tell Claire. I don't want her to know that I did this thing to myself." And the son has to treat his father like a baby, has to clean his bottom and all of that. And because he has to hide this from his wife at his father's request, he has to put the dirty laundry in a bag and throw it in the car and take it to a coin operated, all that stuff. Well, when he comes back and gets his father into bed, cleaned it into bed, and he comes back to the bathroom, it's covered with shit. And he says, "I looked at this and thought, where do I begin?" And he says to us in the memoir, "It was just like beginning a new novel." And you say to yourself, what? In what way is what you have to do to clean this dirty bathroom like beginning a new novel? Well, it's the kind of thing that only a novelist would say. I would never look at that scene and think it's like beginning a new novel because I've never written a novel. But the idea that that's the comparison that leaps into his head, he's not trying to impress us. He's a novelist. At this point in his life, he's written more than a dozen novels. It's the kind of thing that only a person whose novel writing is in their DNA would say about such a very different experience of a burden.
So, Mark, just picking up on what you said before about similes and metaphors, it strikes me, especially since you said, which is I think pretty clear, that metaphors are sometimes harder to spot
Yeah.
linguistically, compared to similes. It might be helpful to people that are watching. Could you just like list off 2 or 3 of the pretty good metaphors to have noticed in this story?
No, because I didn't do that in preparation for today. But I'll say this. The wisdom about metaphors and similes is this. Both of them are comparisons between apparently unlike things. And when you talk about the two kinds of comparisons collectively, we use the shorthand term of metaphor. What is the metaphor? How is metaphor used in the story? By which English teachers mean both the comparison that's explicit, um, my love is like a red, red rose, and the one that's implicit, saying there was a fragrance about her that was stunning and not making it explicit what it is. So metaphors and similes are comparisons between things that are apparently unlike, and the poet's or writer's genius is seeing the connection that we didn't see before. And the poet who says, cleaning this bathroom is like starting a new novel, has seen something that we didn't see until he or she pointed it out. So, in a simile or metaphor, you're talking about something. My girlfriend, my love, Robert Burns has a love. She's in the poem. That's what I'm talking about. She's the subject. And then I want to tell you something about her because you don't know her. And I have to figure out how can I tell you something about my love that will make it known to you even though you don't know her. And I want to tell you that she's beautiful and she is, her beauty is mortal and transient and delicate. And I say she's like a red, red rose. And in that simile, the like, I've done this work. I have figured out some kind of container that's not in the poem. The poem in which he says, my love is like a red, red rose, has a love in it. It has no rose. The poet had to bring the rose in to do the work. And in fact, that word is called a vehicle. What vehicle can I find for me to tell Michael what my love is like? And so I import this car, this truck, and that's the rose. And you say to yourself, okay, so Mark just said his love is like a red, red rose. And what the vehicle is carrying is the work of the metaphor or simile. That's what you have to do, what Michael has to do as a reader. And Michael might say, well, if she's like a red, red rose, she's probably very beautiful. Yes, Michael, right, that's what I intended. And she's probably delicate and maybe she's fragrant. Maybe she has a rose-like smell. Yes. What else, Michael? And then she's thorny. She has thorn. No, Michael. And she needs manure in order to be no, Michael, you're going in the wrong direction. Well, that's the challenge. Once you have the vehicle that I brought into the poem, remember, the poem is not about roses. Just like when someone says, don't cry over spilt milk, there's no spilt milk in the area. That's why children and people who don't know English or whatever language we're talking about are confounded by similes and metaphors. You as a reader, Michael as a reader of my sentence has to decide what are the things about roses that make sense what Mark is telling me about his love and what don't. And that's why it's such a collaborative process. That's not answering Michael's question, but if you understood what I just said, you learned something about the poetry of metaphors and similes.
I think that's pretty good, Mark. I think it's pretty good.
Well, I hope always to be pretty good. You know, back in the day, I was anonymous, and then I got more confident, and I use my name now.
Well, here's a comment from Alan. He says it's a FYI, I will be 90 in February.
God bless you.
And I have 3,000 records, many 78s, and my children don't want them, and I am trying to winnow them down, but not fast enough for them. But those records are playing all day long. So I heard what the daughters were talking about here, and it makes me try harder, but I'm afraid I really need those records.
So let me say that this Alan is a friend of mine and a man I met in Rye, New York, when he was good enough to invite me to do programming there that I've now done for years. And in his retirement, he moved from Rye to Rhode Island with his ailing wife, who is now departed. And Alan and I keep in touch multiple times a month. And I just remembered that he's present, and I understand exactly what that's like. And I do understand about when you want your heritage to be something you want to keep, but you also want to give away, especially to your children. And I am reminded by a great line by a great poet, Robert Frost, who said, well spent is well saved. And he means that in every way of spending. If you spend money well, you've saved something, the experience of whatever it is. If you have spent time doing something you enjoy, like sitting by a lakeside and contemplating nature, that spending of time, you've saved something that you take away. And if you spend yourself in listening to records or giving books away, whatever it is, if you have the right attitude, you've also saved something. I think Frost had a real genius in that well spent is well saved.
Nice.
So I'll say this, are we nearing the top of the hour?
We are. You've got about a minute or two.
Okay, so let me say this as a closing because I feel this very strongly. And those of you who are here today likely have been here before. So, one of the great things about a book group or a bridge game or a symphony orchestra or watching a baseball game or a good movie is that the art, the art of playing Scrabble or of listening to us have this conversation or of seeing Othello has an artificialness that gives it a form. Today, the hours between 3 and 4 on a Tuesday afternoon that has no special resonance for most of us, it all of a sudden had meaning because the library and Michael and I put some work together and gave it shape. We spent an hour, and people who don't know why anybody would spend an hour talking about a short story, or people, and you know some people like this, don't understand why anyone would want to spend a beautiful May day walking around a museum. And those people say, I just don't, you're wasting your time. No, you're spending your time, and what you spent is well saved because what the museum or the symphony, or I hope this conversation today with us has done, is giving you something you have and that you can't lose. So I want to thank again Michael always for not only inviting me and the library for funding this, but for being such a good partner. Thank all of you for coming. Thanks to all of you, named or unnamed, and I'm not making fun of anyone who wants to be anonymous. I understand that. But thank all of you who made comments, additions, or questions. And I hope to see you metaphorically next time.
Okay, Mark, I think that's great. And I was just looking on the calendar to remind us when it is. Just give me a second. So it is June 3. So that's when we'll be back, folks, on June 3. And we'll be doing it again, as we said, on Zoom at 3 in the afternoon. And we'll play it by ear for the final one. Hopefully we get enough interest that it's worthwhile for us to all get together in person. That would be nice. But, it depends on the level of interest. But we'll see you all on June 3 on Zoom for the next Atwood story.
We'll be there. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.